Hello, thank you for being here on Patreon. I have quite an update for you this month, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I did just get back from Roots Roadhouse in LA. I got to catch a little bit of Teddy and the Rough Riders performance. They're, I would say at this point, an upcoming band from Nashville. And Zephaniah O'Hora is probably someone you've heard before. He was great again. I got to see an old friend of mine, Dallas Moore, again. It was great to see him, give him a hug, say howdy. Doug Kershaw, of course, headlined with the Dave and Deke combo backing him. They put on a serious show. Serious show. It was amazing. Everyone loved it. I also got a lot of good reviews from the live interview that I did with Doug Kershaw. It sort of ended up turning into a half comedy routine because I made a real poor decision to start the evening. There were two stools, and I thought that he should have the one that was cushioned, but I did not think enough about the fact that that cushioned stool was also on wheels. I was seated in an uncushioned stool that I thought did not look very comfortable for him to sit in. So I sat in it, and then he came out after I introduced him, and he sat down on the stool that I picked for him, which was much more comfortable, but again, on wheels. And he went rolling pretty far. I reached out and grabbed him, brought him back over by me. Pretty quickly found out that if I let go of his stool at all, he would go rolling across the stage again. Fortunately, he's been performing his entire life, and I have been on stages my entire life. So we both, I think, did a pretty good job of playing it off, made a lot of jokes, made a lot of people laugh, and got some pretty amazing information out of Doug Kershaw, which I will share with you. But I've been teasing a conversation about fact-checking cocaine and rhinestones, which is also a conversation that fits into this situation of being asked if I want to do a live interview with someone that I've made an episode about. I could see a lot of people wondering why I wouldn't want to have an interview like that in private with someone like Doug Kershaw before I make an episode of the podcast about someone like Doug Kershaw. That's a fair question, and I may have answered it in the past, but I think it's reasonable to assume that I'll have to repeat certain things every so often. This is probably one of those things. It already takes a lot of time to fact check cocaine and rhinestones. I'm currently in the middle of dealing with the fact that sometimes I have to read an entire book to fact check some detail that, may not seem important to a casual listener, but I don't know how great of a word casual is to describe the listeners that Cocaine and Rhinestones has. I care enough about this myself to even start working on it. That's obviously a lot. But based on my email inbox, it's fair to say there are a lot of other people who care, possibly even more than I do, about some of this stuff. Doug Kershaw himself told me that the people who live in Crowley, Louisiana, pronounce it Crowley, Louisiana. As soon as he started to tell me how residents of Crowley, Louisiana say the name of their town, I knew exactly what he was going to talk about. I would not want to venture to guess how many people have emailed me to tell me that I called it Crowley, and that's not what they say. That's fine. I mispronounce things sometimes. That's not the kind of thing I'd lose any sleep over. Sometimes Doug Kershaw says Louisiana, sometimes he says Louisiana. I've heard him say it both ways in one conversation, Basically, I get emails about every minute detail. If I've said something on the show as if it may be anything remotely like a fact, I've probably gotten an email about it. That's great. I'm glad people care. So far, there hasn't been anything I feel is worth issuing a full-on retraction. That is something I'm proud of, and it's a tradition that I would like to carry forward through the entirety of this podcast existence. Sometimes I'll use one wrong word by mistake. Usually I can just go back and cut it out of the episode. It's that small of a deal. But if I got something wrong that actually mattered, to where I did feel like I had to go back and issue a retraction, I would do that. but I would much rather not have to do that. One thing about retractions that I don't know whether this is common knowledge or not, but a retraction of a statement can generally be assumed to have been seen or heard by many fewer people than heard the original, in any case that would require a retraction, incorrect statement. In other words, the first version that someone hears is usually the version that sticks in their memory. I've also heard that the first version of events someone hears is usually the version that sticks in their memory, even if they're being told that it's not what actually happened. So yeah, get it right the first time. Sometimes you gotta read a few extra books. So what? I'm going to make every effort to make sure I don't say something that is untrue. So at least if I'm gonna get emails about it, which I will get emails about it no matter what I say, I'd rather know that I'm right or know that I presented the information in a way that it should be clear I'm not certain that I'm right, and let you know if maybe I'm leaning on opinion when I say some things. I hope these things are obvious to close listeners of the show. I think it's reasonable to assume I'm talking to close listeners of the show right now, so thank you. And this also ties into another reason why I don't want to do original interviews in production for Cocaine and Rhinestones episodes. And it's the same reason to not focus on anything that's happened in the 21st century. I don't feel confident that I or anyone else really knows what they're talking about because there hasn't been enough time for the first version to be corrected. Yes, what we think is happening right now is what most people are going to spend the rest of their lives continuing to think is what happened. I'm not sure they're right yet. It takes time for the first version of events to be corrected. If there have been 10 or 5 or even 2 books written on something that I'm talking about, there's a strong chance they were written at least 20 years ago. So they've been out for a long time. Anyone who's interested has read those books. And if some of those people happen to know that things in those books aren't correct, those people have had a lot of time to make as much noise as they're going to make about it. If you give me 20 years of distance, I can reasonably assume the first version of events has been corrected in some significant way. Maybe someone else wrote a book about it that tells a different version of events that adds up better. Maybe the author had to issue a retraction because the general public had enough time to find out how to contact that person and let them know how wrong they were about something. Now, the major argument I could see people having against my position on this is that I could put new information out there from somebody who either hasn't gone on record before or hasn't gone on record with a certain piece of information before. Again, this is exactly why I would not want to do this with Cocaine and Rhinestones. If the source or the information really is so new, then it hasn't had time to be corrected. And that's not a foundation I'm ever going to want to build an episode of Cocaine and Rhinestones on. What I want is to try and document as accurately as possible the history of country music in the 1900s, using sources that have had time to have their flaws pointed out. Sometimes I will be the person pointing out these flaws. But if I do get a chapter of that history of country music in the 1900s done, and someone who was an active participant in those events wants to then come and fill in some of the gaps or even tell me how wrong I am, I've got time to listen to that person talk. So when I spoke with Doug Kershaw in LA last month, it was in front of a live audience. A lot of them let me know that they were listening to the show. I believe I even met some people who are probably watching this video right now. Hey again. But I didn't want to assume everyone there had heard it, so Doug and I had a conversation that partly recapped the story in the Kershaw's episode of this podcast. And Doug was able to give me more information on some of those things. He also told us some entirely new stories that I know a ton of people there hadn't heard before. One thing is Doug said the whole reason he started writing songs at all is because the first time he went to record as a singer, he tried to sing a song that was written by someone else, and he got told that he wasn't a good singer. So he went and he wrote songs that he knew he'd be singing the right way because he was the one who wrote them, is the gist of the story. Here's another great story. After Rusty and Doug had a local hit on Feature Records, Doug talked JD Miller into taking Doug with JD on JD's next trip to Nashville. Now, I didn't want to get too deep in the weeds on the JD Miller stuff during this live interview in front of people who may not have had any idea what we were talking about. So I didn't ask Doug how much truth there was to some of the things I speculated about in the Kershaw's episode. I don't have any more answers on those things. But it does make a lot of sense to me that Doug Kershaw, being a smart guy, would want to cut out the middleman either way. If he saw JD Miller had this thing going on with Hickory Records, a train just started going by. So I don't know if y'all be able to hear that. I apologize if you do. If Doug Kershaw knew that JD Miller had this thing going on between Feature Records, his small local label, and Acuff Rose, a bigger outfit up in Nashville who had just kicked off Hickory Records, I don't think it would take Doug Kershaw very long to find that information out before he started trying to figure out how to get to Nashville himself. He made a comment when I asked him what he thought about the first time he went to Nashville after recording in Crowley, Louisiana. I think he said, "I didn't think much of it." And I wasn't sure if he was saying that he hadn't spent much time thinking about what Nashville might be like in comparison to Crowley. I also wasn't sure he might have meant that he wasn't impressed with Nashville, which, in my opinion, would be a very Doug Kershaw thing for him to say. Up in the air on that one, though. Don't know his intention. So JD Miller takes his new local hit maker with him up to Nashville, along with the brand new master recording of the song So Lovely Baby. This was a song that was planned to be released on Feature. JD Miller told, I presume, a room full of people from Acuff Rose that this song was for sure going to be a hit. And then he pressed play on a machine that pretty quickly shredded the single recording that they had of the song. I don't know how much of the song played before that happened, but it was apparently enough for Wesley Rose to say he'd take them. So Lovely Baby ended up being Rusty and Doug's first single released on Hickory Records. I thought that story was awesome. One thing I really wanted to get Doug's perspective on was Rusty Kershaw, Doug's little brother, deciding that he didn't want to be in Rusty and Doug anymore. It did occur to me that Doug might not want to talk about this. Fortunately, I had a second before the interview to ask him in private if it was all right to talk about this. He was fine with us talking about it on stage, and what he said is that one day he realized he couldn't make another person chase his dreams, and Rusty didn't share Doug's dreams. I believe I told him that was a very mature realization for him to have. Doug did also say something like the breakup with Rusty was the worst divorce he'd ever been through. So I guess it might have taken him a little while to get to that realization. Because of that stool business, we were going off on a lot of tangents, like I said, trying to keep everything on the rails. At one point, Doug started to say something about fighting with himself for 3 years over making a go of it as a solo artist. After we got sidetracked on one of those tangents, he came back to that subject and started talking about how he was just playing sets on his own in Printer's Alley here in Nashville when the Johnny Cash Show producers came calling. And there was some extra context he was able to give me on this story that I was glad to have. The choice that Doug had with the Johnny Cash Show, it wasn't so much a choice between being in the house band on every episode or getting a feature spot on one episode. It was specifically about being in the first episode because of that whole Bob Dylan thing. Again, Bob Dylan had been on a hiatus. So as much of a big deal as it was for Bob Dylan to be on TV, it was a way bigger deal than it would have been. So the producers, I guess, kind of thought that Doug might be intimidated by that. Doug, if you think you might get nervous being in the first episode with Bob Dylan, we'll let you be in a few other episodes and you don't have to compete with the most famous songwriter on the planet. Now, we know the choice that he made, and Doug Kershaw said that he made that choice because if he was going to be a big star, then he'd have to stand there with the big stars. Again, very Doug Kershaw thing to say. He also confirmed that he let Bob Dylan try on some of his velvet suits back at the hotel. Apparently, Doug Kershaw showed up with a suitcase full of velvet suits, and Bob Dylan all of a sudden felt underdressed. Keep in mind, this was after his 60s period of looking all fashionable and everything, and he'd gone away and come back, sort of this farmer look. So here comes Doug Kershaw in crushed velvet. So apparently Doug really did let Bob Dylan try on his suits, but in the end, he told Bob Dylan that he looked better as Bob Dylan than Doug Kershaw. This all made perfect sense to me, as Doug Kershaw has made me feel underdressed on several occasions. I know a lot of people were turned on to Rusty Kershaw's Cajun in the Blues Country album through the podcast. I think that's really cool. Doug told us a little bit about how that album came to exist at all. It turns out after Doug signed with Warner Brothers, but before his album had come out, and so before anyone really knew he was with Warner's, Atlantic called and tried to sign Doug Kershaw to a recording contract. Doug, of course, had to tell them that he'd already signed to Warner Brothers, but he offered to give Rusty a call if they'd like. Atlantic asked Doug if he would produce Rusty's album, to which Doug, of course, said yes. It was sort of a cool little workaround to get Doug Kershaw in the studio for Atlantic anyways, while not really pissing off Warner Brothers. And the world got a really awesome album as a result. Okay, this is a pretty long update, but in my personal opinion, probably the best one so far. I'll be back next month. Definitely going to talk about the poll episode in season 2. Probably going to talk more about that media network stuff. Everything we're trying with Your Favorite Band Sucks is going great so far. The technology side of things has been really fun to start playing around with. We're about to implement this new dynamic ad stitching technology. It means great things for Cocaine and Rhinestones. I'm fascinated by it, so I'll be interested to talk about it with you and how it's all going to work. So yeah, y'all take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.